They mocked her tattoo at the naval base until the general saluted and said, "Welcome back, ma'am." Under the burning sky of the naval training ground, laughter cut through the morning air like shrapnel. A group of young recruits circled near the sandbags, grinning wide, sweat gleaming on their faces. One of them pointed at the woman tightening her gloves beside the obstacle line. "She's paid to serve us," he shouted, and the group erupted again, their voices echoing against the metal fences. She didn't look up. Her boots were caked with dust, her gray t-shirt darkened by the desert heat, but her movements were steady, mechanical, disciplined. She adjusted the strap on her wrist, revealing a faded tattoo. 28 of 4Z. The numbers looked ordinary, almost meaningless. Almost. Someone whistled. "Nice ink, Grandma. Prison tag or grocery code?" No answer. She finished rolling up her sleeve, eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the wire. The wind whipped across the base, carrying the smell of salt and engine oil. Her name tag read Harper, though few ever used it. To most, she was the tech, the civilian assigned to keep the gear working while the real sailors trained. She arrived before dawn, left after dark, and spoke to no one unless it was about tools, torque, or diagnostics. A sergeant tossed a wrench onto the bench near her. "You missed a spot on that recoil housing," he said, his tone sharp. She wiped the metal once, slow and even. "Now it's clean, sir." Her voice was low, calm, too calm for someone being mocked in front of half the unit. That quiet only made them laugh harder. What none of them noticed, what none of them could notice, was the way she checked every sightline, every vent, every corner of the yard before returning to her work. Old habits. The kind that didn't fade with rank or time. The youngest recruit leaned closer, squinting at her wrist. "Ma'am, what does that even mean, 28 of 4Z? Her gaze flicked to him, flat and unreadable. "It's a reminder," she said. "A reminder of what?" She tightened her glove again. "Survival." The laughter faltered. A few exchanged uneasy looks. One of them muttered, "Weird." Another shrugged, forcing a chuckle, trying to reclaim the moment. Far across the yard, the sound of boots approached, measured, heavy, deliberate. The recruits snapped halfway to attention as a shadow fell over the sand. A high-ranking officer, his cap crisp and his ribbons bright, stopped mid-stride. His eyes caught the mark on Harper's wrist. He froze. Silence spread like shockwave through the platoon. Harper met his gaze without a word. Dust swirled between them, carried by the wind off the sea. The officer's hand rose slowly to his brow in salute. "Welcome back, ma'am." "And Cruz." The recruits stared, mouths open, unsure whether to stand, speak, or breathe. Harper gave a single nod, then turned back to her tools, the same calm, steady rhythm as before, as if the world hadn't just shifted under their feet. Courage doesn't ask for applause. It just remembers what must be done. The silence lingered long after the salute, settling over the training yard like a storm that had forgotten to break. The recruits, moments ago loud with arrogance, now shifted uneasily in their boots, unsure whether to meet her eyes or pretend she wasn't there. Harper didn't offer them a glance. She simply reached for the wrench again, her gloves creasing under the weight of habit, her movements measured, deliberate, each rotation of her wrist echoing discipline born from years no one here could imagine. The officer who had saluted her, a Navy general whose name alone commanded silence, stood frozen for another second, then turned sharply toward his aide. Words were exchanged in hushed tones, quick and clipped, before he disappeared into the hangar with the authority of a man who suddenly realized history was standing in front of him again. Harper exhaled softly, her expression unchanged, though the faintest tremor in her hand betrayed the gravity of the moment. Around her, the recruits began to whisper, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. "Who the hell is she?" one asked, voice low. Another muttered, "No one gets a salute like that unless," and trailed off, the unspoken possibilities hanging heavy in the dry air. Harper moved past them without a sound, heading toward the maintenance bay where a half-dismantled drone launcher lay waiting. The steel shimmered faintly under the desert sun, the scent of oil sharp and familiar. Inside the hangar, she peeled off her gloves, revealing calloused hands marked by scars too old to belong to any civilian contractor. She ran her fingers along the side of the launcher, eyes scanning for imperfections, as if the machine were an extension of her own body. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence until the young sergeant, the same one who had mocked her minutes earlier, stepped into the doorway, his posture stiff and uncertain. "Ma'am," he began, hesitating on the word, "I didn't mean any disrespect. We just thought—" "You thought wrong," she said evenly, not turning around. Her voice was not harsh, but it carried weight, an authority that required no volume. Respect isn't about who wears what rank. It's about who's earned it when no one was watching. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "Yes, ma'am." Then he retreated, the echo of his boots fading into the hall. Harper watched the shadows on the concrete floor shift as the sun moved higher, casting the hangar in an amber hue that made the air itself seem older, heavier. For a moment, her reflection glinted off the metal casing, hard eyes, drawn mouth, a face that had seen too much and said too little. Her mind drifted back to another base, another lifetime, deep beneath the surface of the Pacific. The memory came in fragments, the metallic groan of a submarine hull under pressure, the hiss of ruptured airlines, a commander's final order before the world went dark. The call sign 28A4Z wasn't ink for decoration. It was designation and identity erased from official record after the incident the Navy swore never happened. Harper had been declared missing in action, presumed dead with her crew. The only thing that survived was her code and her silence. A mechanic approached, carrying a clipboard, unaware of the tension in the air. "Ma'am, are you sure about recalibrating the stabilizer manually? The system's sensitive one wrong step could trigger." "Then don't take the wrong step," she interrupted, her tone steady, eyes still fixed on the machine. "This system isn't fragile. It just needs someone who remembers what it was built for." He nodded quickly, stepping back as she reattached a panel and checked the circuit alignment. Sparks flared briefly, the blue light reflecting in her eyes. "Looks operational," he said quietly. "It will be," she replied, "when it matters." By late afternoon, the desert wind had picked up, rattling the loose chains that lined the fence outside. The same recruits now stood in formation for inspection, their faces flushed from hours under the Sunday. Harper crossed the yard with a quiet authority that made them straighten instinctively, even though she wasn't in uniform command. The sergeant called out the standard order, but his voice wavered. The moment she passed, conversation died again, replaced by something like respect, or perhaps fear. From the observation deck above, 2 officers watched her in silence. "That's her, isn't it?" one whispered. "The one from the Phantom Recovery Unit?" The other nodded grimly. "They said she went down with the sub near Okinawa, classified beyond top secret." Harper stopped at the far end of the yard, where a memorial plaque was mounted into the concrete wall. The names etched into its surface shimmered faintly under the sunlight, and her fingers traced one near the top, Commander Isaac Reeves. The world around her blurred for a second, the sound of drills and shouting replaced by the deep, muted thrum of the sea pressing against steel. She blinked once, grounding herself in the heat of the present, not the cold of memory. Behind her, the recruits stood still, watching. One of them, the youngest, finally spoke. "Ma'am, that tattoo, was it real?" She turned slightly, her expression softening, though her eyes remained distant. "Every mark means something real," she said quietly. "The question is whether you've earned the right to carry it." The boy nodded, unable to find words. Harper adjusted her sleeve back down, covering the tattoo once more. The wind tugged at her hair, and she looked toward the ocean glinting in the distance. Somewhere out there, the wreck of her ship still slept beneath miles of water, a tomb no one was allowed to name. The general's voice echoed faintly from the loudspeaker, calling for evening assembly. Harper's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. For everyone else, it was just another day at the base. For her, it was another reminder that ghosts never rest, they just learn to live among the living. She turned away from the plaque and started walking, her shadow long against the sand, her steps steady, deliberate, the same rhythm she'd kept through every storm. And though no one dared speak it aloud, every man who had mocked her that morning now understood the unspoken rule of every battlefield. The quiet ones are the ones you salute last. That night the base felt different, quieter, as if the very air had learned to hold its breath around her. Floodlights burned across the parade ground, throwing long shadows between the hangars, and the scent of salt water mixed with machine oil in the wind. Harper moved through the corridors of the command wing, a place she hadn't set foot in for nearly 15 years, her boots echoing softly against the tiled floor that once led to her unit's control room. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighted by ghosts that had followed her back from the depths. Inside the briefing hall, the young officers gathered around glowing monitors, their voices low and tense. The general stood at the front, his cap resting on the table beside a classified folder stamped in red. Obsidian Protocol. Harper stopped in the doorway, unnoticed at first, until the general's gaze lifted and silence fell across the room. "You should hear this," he said quietly, gesturing her closer. She hesitated, then walked forward, the hum of electronics rising with her heartbeat. The holographic map projected a cluster of red markers spreading across the Pacific, unidentified subsurface activity matching the signature of the old Phantom fleet, the one that had vanished with her. "Those coordinates," she said slowly, "they're near the trench where we went down." Her voice carried neither surprise nor fear, only the precision of someone who already knew what the data meant. The general nodded, jaw tight. "We thought the wreck was sealed, but something's moving out there. Something carrying your call sign." A ripple of unease passed through the officers. Harper's hands clenched unconsciously, the phantom ache of cold water creeping up her arms as memory flashed behind her eyes. The explosion, the chaos, the order to dive deeper when escape was still possible, she remembered it all too clearly. "You need someone who knows those systems," she said at last, steady but resolute. "You need someone who's already been there." The general met her gaze, and for a long moment neither spoke. Then he gave a small nod, the kind that sealed unspoken orders. By dawn, the hangar roared to life again. Helicopters lined the tarmac, technicians shouting over engines, floodlights flickering against the metallic skin of the waiting aircraft. Harper stood beside the lead chopper, wearing a tactical vest with no insignia, her name tag stripped clean. Around her, the same recruits from yesterday prepared for deployment, their expressions subdued, disciplined now in a way mockery could never teach. None dared speak as she checked their gear, her movements swift and methodical, the embodiment of a soldier reborn. The sergeant approached with a flight tablet, voice low. "Orders say we're recon only, ma'am. No engagement." Harper secured the last strap on her pack and looked at him. "Orders always say that," she replied, "until the world catches fire." Her words carried no drama, only experience, and he understood immediately. The helicopters lifted off in formation, slicing through the dawn haze over the ocean. Below them, the waves glimmered like steel, indifferent to the lives hovering above. Harper sat near the open door, eyes fixed on the horizon where the sea met the clouds. Every vibration of the rotor felt like a heartbeat from the past, every gust of wind whispering the same name she'd tried to forget: Reeves. Her commander, her friend, the one she'd left behind when the hatch sealed and the water rushed in. They reached the coordinates just before sunrise. The sonar screen lit up with faint signals, irregular but deliberate, forming a pattern only Harper recognized. "It's a distress code," she said, her voice rising over the engine noise. "Modified from our old encryption sequence. Someone or something down there knows we're listening." The general's voice crackled through comms, ordering a visual sweep. Harper leaned out, scanning the endless blue until a flash of metallic reflection broke the surface. A buoy, ancient and rusted, bearing the same number carved into her wrist. 28. A 4Z. "Drop altitude," she commanded. The pilot hesitated only a second before complying. The helicopter descended, and Harper stepped onto the deck of a small Navy vessel waiting below. Waves slammed against the hull as she approached the buoy, prying open its corroded hatch. Inside was a data core, blinking faintly, still alive after all these years. She plugged the module into the ship's terminal, and the screen came to life with lines of encrypted code, resolving into a message stamped with her old unit insignia, a black serpent coiled around a trident. The room fell silent as a recorded voice filled the air, rough and distorted by time. "If you're hearing this, then the sea kept its promise. The ghosts are awake. Finish what we started." The crew exchanged uneasy glances, waiting for someone to interpret what that meant. Harper stared at the screen, every muscle in her body coiled tight, her breath slow and even. "It's not a message," she said finally. "It's a trigger." Moments later, alarms blared. The radar lit up again, multiple contacts rising from the trench, moving fast. Harper turned to the communications officer. Send immediate alert to command. This isn't salvage, it's resurrection. The deck lurched as the first tremor hit, waves crashing higher. The officer hesitated, fear flickering in his eyes. Harper grabbed the headset and spoke into the mic herself. This is Operator 28. A 4Z, Phantom assets reactivated. Initiate countermeasure Grid 5. Her tone was iron, her authority unquestionable. As the ship maneuvered into position, the general's voice came through once more, calm but firm. Harper, you shouldn't even be out there. She glanced at the rising water, the flashing lights reflecting off her face. I was already out here, she said quietly. I just stopped pretending otherwise. The next surge struck hard, and for a moment, every sound disappeared beneath the roar of the sea. Then, through the chaos, the sonar pinged one final signal, a single coded phrase repeating over and over, the same words engraved in the plaque she'd touched the day before. The brave never sleep. Harper stared into the horizon, the wind tearing through her hair, and smiled a small, tired curve of defiance and peace. Behind her, the recruits scrambled to their stations, no longer laughing, no longer doubting. The woman they had mocked was no longer invisible. She was Command Reborn, a living relic of duty that refused to die. When the sky darkened and the storm rose around them, Harper raised her head to the wind, voice low but steady, speaking to the ghosts that waited beneath. All right, she murmured. Let's finish the mission. And as lightning split the clouds above, the ocean answered not with thunder, but with the quiet, relentless heartbeat of a legend returning home. The storm that had gathered over the Pacific now raged in full, waves slamming against the hull as if the ocean itself were trying to reclaim its secrets. The ship pitched under the force, lightning cracking across the black sky, each flash illuminating Harper's silhouette at the command rail. The crew clung to their stations, drenched and exhausted, their eyes darting between the storm and the woman who stood unmoved at its center. She didn't bark orders, she didn't need to. Every gesture, every clipped command carried the weight of someone who had led men through worse than this. Someone who had once been swallowed by the sea and still come back breathing. Through the static of the comms, the sonar officer shouted, "Multiple objects surfacing bearing 090. The radar screen bloomed with movement, dozens of blips converging, shapes too fast to be debris. Harper's gaze sharpened as the first shadow broke the surface. The twisted frame of an unmanned submersible, its hull scarred with the phantom insignia, her unit's mark. It drifted like a corpse brought home by the tide, lights flickering weakly before dying out. "They're ours," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "They're all ours." The general's voice burst through the comms, urgent and controlled. "Harper, we have authorization to withdraw. Repeat, fall back immediately, this isn't your burden anymore." She didn't answer. Her hand gripped the rail until her knuckles turned white, eyes locked on the shifting water. Something deeper was rising, a shape larger than any submarine she'd ever seen. The sea heaved upward as the vessel breached, an immense, rusted leviathan forcing daylight from the storm. Across its ruined hull, faint letters spelled the name she'd tried so long to forget. USS Orpheus. The crew stumbled back, disbelief painted across their faces. "That's impossible," someone murmured. "She went down 20 years ago." Harper's pulse hammered in her ears, every memory she'd buried roaring back through the thunder. The Orpheus had been her ship, her command after Reeves fell, and if the systems were still active, it meant someone, or something, had kept them alive all this time. "Power down our grid," she ordered quietly. "If it recognizes us as hostile, we're done before we start." Her calm steadied the crew more than any rank could. Lights dimmed across the deck, leaving only the intermittent glow of lightning to reveal the ghost ship ahead. The Orpheus drifted closer, her tower cracked, her cannons half melted, but her core a live reactor humming beneath layers of ruin. A metallic groan carried over the storm, like a beast awakening from a long sleep. The communications officer stammered. "Receiving broadcast. Ma'am, encrypted. But it's using your clearance level." Harper moved to the console, water dripping from her sleeves, and entered a code no one else should have known. The signal cleared, and through the speakers came a familiar voice, ragged but alive. "Harper, this is Reeves. If you're hearing this, the Orpheus found you first. The world above isn't ready for what's down here. You know what to do." Hem. Her breath caught, her eyes closed for one heartbeat of disbelief and grief intertwined. Around her, the crew stared, recognizing the name from the classified memorial plaque. "Reeves is dead," the sergeant whispered, but Harper's silence said otherwise. She straightened slowly, her voice steady when she finally spoke. "No one is dead until the sea says so." End quote. She ordered the launch of the ROV's small underwater drones equipped with cameras and sonar, sending them into the churning dark where the Orpheus waited. The monitors flickered as images formed, corridors half collapsed, bulkheads lined with algae, and then, impossibly, movement silhouettes in the murky water, human shapes tethered to the ship's core, like marionettes in the current. The youngest recruit recoiled. "God, are those crew remnants?" Harper cut in. "Artificial stasis." He found a way to keep them alive. The general's voice returned, harsh and demanding. "Harper, abort this mission. That ship's reactor could destabilize the entire sector. We can't risk losing you again." She looked toward the looming wreck, the lightning reflecting off its hull like veins of fire. "Sir," she said softly, "I wasn't lost. I was left." Then she cut the comm line. She signaled the deckhands to prepare the descent pod. The sergeant stepped forward, soaked and trembling. "Ma'am, you can't go down there alone." Harper met his eyes, and for the first time, her expression softened. "You're right," she said, "but some debts don't get paid in company." She fastened the harness, the tattoo on her wrist glistening under the emergency lights. "Keep the engines warm. If I'm not back in 1 hour, you leave. That's an order." The pod plunged into the water with a hiss, swallowed instantly by darkness. Inside, Harper steadied her breathing, her fingers tracing the old scar above her collarbone, a relic of that last day aboard the Orpheus. The controls lit faintly as the sub descended, and through the viewport she saw the massive outline of her ship, the vessel that had been both her pride and her grave. Her voice broke the silence. "Orpheus, this is Operator 28, a 4Z, requesting permission to come aboard." The ship responded with a deep vibration, a pulse that rattled the glass, and a faint blue glow spread through the water ahead. When the pod docked with the airlock, she stepped inside, boots sinking into a thin layer of silt. The air was heavy with salt and rust, the kind of stillness that only existed in places forgotten by time. Down the main corridor, dim lights flickered one by one, as if recognizing her presence. "Welcome back, ma'am," said a synthetic voice from the overhead speaker, Reeves's voice, distorted through machine code. Harper's chest tightened. "You always were terrible at goodbyes," she whispered. At the core chamber, the reactor pulsed faintly, its containment seals barely holding. Data screens scrolled with her old commands, systems waiting for final authorization. The message Reeves had left replayed again. "Finish what we started." Harper stared at the console, realizing what he'd meant. The Orpheus's AI had kept the reactor stable by consuming its crew's life support cycles, turning their stasis into fuel. The only way to end it was to trigger a manual shutdown that would flood the entire ship. She placed her palm over the biometric reader. The system recognized her instantly, lights turning from red to green. Her voice was calm, almost serene. "Override protocol final purge authorization. For all who never made it home." The countdown began, a deep hum filling the chamber, like the heartbeat of the ocean itself. She looked once more at the reactor core, the swirling light within it, and whispered, "Rest now, Reeves. You kept your promise." Above, the crew watched as the Orpheus's lights flared one last time beneath the waves, a brilliant pulse that illuminated the storm-tossed sea. Then, in perfect silence, it vanished, taking its ghosts with it. The sonar screens cleared, the water leveling into calm. The general's voice crackled through static, but no response came. Minutes later, the ocean surface broke again, and a single flare rose from the depths, white, steady, defiant. The crew erupted in cheers and tears alike as the descent pod surfaced, battered but intact. Harper emerged slowly, the rain streaming down her face, her expression unreadable. She saluted the horizon where the Orpheus had gone, then turned to her trembling team. "Mission complete," she said quietly. "Let's go home." As the ship turned toward the coastline, dawn broke through the retreating clouds, painting the sea in silver and gold. Behind them, the waves rolled peacefully once more, carrying away the final trace of a legend reborn and redeemed. And in that fragile calm, every man aboard understood what the general had meant when he saluted her the day before some ranks are earned not by service, but by sacrifice. Morning came slowly, the storm retreating like a wounded animal, leaving behind the stillness of disbelief. The ocean lay flat again, calm and glassy, as though it had conspired to hide every trace of what had happened the night before. Harper stood at the stern of the recovery vessel, her hair pulled back, her uniform drenched and salt-stiff, staring at the faint line of sunrise that painted the horizon in bruised gold. Around her, the crew worked in near silence, voices hushed not out of fatigue but reverence. No one quite knew how to speak to someone who had walked into the depths and come back carrying ghosts. The general's voice came through the comms again, softer this time, stripped of command. "We have confirmation, Harper. The Orpheus is gone. You stopped the chain reaction." There was a pause before he added, "You saved them." She didn't respond immediately. Her hands rested on the railing, the tattoo on her wrist, half faded by seawater and time. "No, sir," she said finally, her tone even. "They saved themselves. I only kept my promise." The line went quiet after that, the general understanding what she didn't say: some debts can't be cleared by survival. When the ship reached the naval base, the pier was already lined with personnel waiting in formation. The same recruits who had once mocked her now stood at full attention, eyes forward, shoulders squared, their nervous laughter replaced by something solemn and proud. The moment Harper stepped off the gangway, the base commander called them to salute. She walked between the rows of uniforms, boots splashing in shallow puddles, the air thick with respect unspoken but undeniable. The general met her halfway, cap in hand. "Welcome home," he said, repeating the same words he'd spoken before, but this time they carried the weight of the world behind them. She gave a faint nod, her eyes tired but steady. "Home is complicated, sir," she said quietly, and that was all. The general understood. He gestured for a medic to check her vitals, but Harper waved them off. "I'm fine," she insisted, though her voice carried the fatigue of someone who had fought both time and memory. Instead of heading to debriefing, she walked toward the far end of the pier, where the memorial wall stood, steel plates engraved with names, polished smooth by years of wind and salt. The same wall she had touched before the mission now glimmered in morning light. She placed her hand against the section marked USS Orpheus, lost with all hands. Slowly, she reached into her pocket and withdrew a small metal pin, its surface etched with the emblem of her old unit, a serpent coiled around a trident. She set it into a groove between the names and whispered, "You're not lost anymore." The wind caught her words and carried them toward the open sea. For a long while she stood there, letting the quiet fill her chest until the ache became bearable again. Behind her, the recruits waited. The youngest of them, the boy who had asked about her tattoo, stepped forward, hesitant but sincere. "Ma'am," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "we didn't know who you were." Harper turned, and though her face was calm, her eyes were softer than they'd been in days. "That's good," she said simply. "You're not supposed to know. Legends are just the stories we tell when we've run out of courage ourselves." The boy frowned slightly. "But you went back. You could have died." Harper glanced at the horizon again, the light glinting off the endless blue. "Everyone dies, son. Not everyone finishes what they started." Then she smiled, faint and fleeting, like the reflection of sunlight on steel, and walked past him toward the main hangar. Inside, the air buzzed with activity again, engineers, pilots, and officers preparing reports and debriefs, all trying to fit what had happened into the language of procedure. Harper ignored the noise, her boots echoing against the concrete floor as she made her way to the far workbench. There, beneath a sheet of tarpaulin, rested the same wrench she had used before everything changed. She picked it up, feeling its familiar weight, and began tightening a loose bracket on the drone housing nearby. The rhythm of the movement soothed her, a small ritual to remind herself that life, like machinery, only stayed functional through maintenance. Hours passed before the general found her again, his shoes clicking softly across the floor. "They want a ceremony," he said, his voice cautious, almost apologetic. "Recognition, medals, commendations, all of it." Harper didn't look up. "They already had their ceremony," she replied, twisting the wrench one last time before setting it down. "It's at the bottom of the Pacific." The general sighed, knowing there was no arguing with her. He placed a small folder on the table instead. Then at least read the official report. You might want to correct a few details. When he left, Harper opened the folder, scanning the printed words. Mission classified. Operator 28. A 4Z presumed active. Operation deemed successful. All personnel accounted for. At the bottom, a handwritten note in unfamiliar ink caught her attention. For those who remember the ones we forget. She closed the file, her expression unreadable, then tucked it into her jacket. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she returned to the dock one last time. The waves rolled gently, tinted red by the fading light, and the sound of gulls echoed overhead. She watched as the sea swallowed the day, her reflection shimmering across the water. For a moment, she could almost see their faces in the ripples. Reeves, the crew, the young versions of themselves laughing in the control room, alive again in memory. Rest easy, she murmured. I'll keep the signal open. A gust of wind swept across the pier, catching the edge of her jacket, and she turned toward the base lights behind her. Somewhere a bell rang, marking the change of watch. The recruits moved in formation near the yard, their cadence steady, their voices echoing discipline instead of mockery now. Harper watched them for a moment, pride flickering behind the stoicism in her gaze. As darkness settled, she walked away from the water, each step measured, quiet, deliberate the way a soldier walks when the mission is done but the duty never ends. Behind her, the memorial wall gleamed faintly under the floodlights, the metal pin she'd placed catching the last sliver of sunset. Its reflection danced briefly, before fading into the deep, endless calm of the sea. And in that stillness, where waves met memory and silence met honor, the world seemed to whisper back her call sign 28A4Z, not as a code, but as a promise kept. By the following week, the naval base had returned to its usual rhythm drills at dawn, orders barked across the yard, and the metallic clatter of equipment echoing off the hangars. Yet under the surface of routine, something intangible had changed. The laughter that once filled the barracks had softened into something quieter, more measured, as though every man and woman on that base had glimpsed the weight of history walking among them. Harper moved through it all like a shadow of the sea, present but untouchable. Her steps slow, deliberate, each one a reminder that peace was not the absence of conflict, but the discipline to carry its memory without breaking. Every morning she arrived before the bugle call, the first to unlock the maintenance wing, her uniform immaculate, her hair tied in the same tight braid. She spoke little, preferring the language of motion, tightening bolts, calibrating systems, aligning the humming cores of drones that would never know her name. The younger recruits watched her from a distance, sometimes whispering the stories that had begun circulating through the ranks, how she had descended into the ocean alone, how a ghost ship had answered her command. She never corrected them. Legends, she knew, were not built from truth alone, but from the silences people filled with their own need to believe. One afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the hangar doors, the general approached her with a sealed envelope in hand. "Orders from command," he said quietly, laying it on the table beside her tools. The paper bore her old classification mark, phantom blue, and for a moment the room seemed to contract around her. "They want you in Washington," he continued. "There's talk of reinstatement, commendation, maybe even a task force." Harper didn't move. Her eyes lingered on the envelope like it was something radioactive. "Sir," she said finally, "I'm not a symbol to be recycled every time the ocean stirs." The general's jaw tightened. "It's not about symbolism, Harper. It's about leadership. These people need to see what duty looks like." She wiped her hands on a rag, the grease streaking her fingers like blackened ink. "Duty doesn't need an audience, General. It just needs someone to remember when the orders stop making sense." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, leaving the envelope where it lay. When the door shut behind him, Harper stared at it for a while before sliding it into the bottom drawer, unopened. That night, unable to sleep, she walked down to the pier where the waves whispered against the pilings. The moon hung low and pale, turning the water silver. She removed her gloves, letting the wind bite at her skin, and stared at the faint lines of her tattoo, now worn into her flesh like a scar. Somewhere beneath those waters lay the Orpheus, entombed in silence, her crew finally at rest. Harper wondered if the sea ever forgot the weight of those it kept, or if it simply learned to carry them gently, the way she had learned to carry their memory. Footsteps sounded behind her. It was the young recruit again, the one who had once mocked her and now followed her like a shadow of redemption. "Ma'am," he said softly, stopping a few feet away. "They're saying the Pentagon wants to name the recovery after you." Harper didn't turn. "Then tell them to name it after the ones who didn't come back." He hesitated, then asked, "Were you scared down there?" She smiled faintly, the expression almost invisible in the dark. "Fear's just the body remembering it's alive," she said. "Courage is what happens when you stop arguing with it." "Ow." The boy nodded, though he didn't fully understand, and after a moment he walked away, his salute crisp even in the dark. Harper watched him go, the corner of her mouth lifting in quiet pride. She turned her gaze back to the sea, the waves folding over themselves in endless rhythm, each one erasing and rewriting the last. The following day, the base held a small memorial at dawn. No cameras, no speeches, just the crew and a flag folded with precision. The general spoke briefly about honor and remembrance, but his words faded into the wind, replaced by the hush of those who knew that some stories were too heavy for ceremony. When it was done, Harper stepped forward and placed a single dog tag into the display case at the front. The engraved letters caught the light eye. Reeves, and for a heartbeat, it felt like the sun had paused in its rise. "You did it," she whispered under her breath. "You brought them home." End quote. As the others dispersed, Harper remained by the case, fingers pressed lightly against the glass. She thought of the countless faces she had seen come and go over the years. The young, the reckless, the ones who believed invincibility was part of the uniform. She thought of how time always stripped that illusion away, leaving only those willing to keep standing when the noise stopped. "Once a soldier," she murmured, "always a protector." And later that evening, as twilight stretched across the tarmac, Harper sat on the bench, overlooking the bay. The air smelled of salt and jet fuel, and somewhere a siren wailed faintly in the distance. She closed her eyes, letting the sounds blend into one another, the hum of engines, the rush of waves, the quiet heartbeat of a world she no longer needed to save, but couldn't quite leave behind. The general found her there once more, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "You could have been an admiral, you know," he said. "Maybe even higher." She chuckled under her breath. "I've had enough of ceilings, sir. The ocean's better. No ranks down there, just depth." He smiled faintly. "Then you'll stay here?" Harper opened her eyes, their reflection mirroring the horizon's last light. "For now," she said, "until someone else remembers what we're supposed to be." When darkness finally fell, the base lights shimmered across the water, a constellation of human persistence. Harper rose from the bench, her figure outlined against the glow, the faint mark on her wrist glinting like a compass guiding her forward. She turned once toward the sea, the words barely audible as she whispered them. "Courage, honor, compassion, those don't fade with time." Then she walked back toward the hangars, the rhythm of her steps slow, steady, eternal, the march of a soldier who had seen the end and chosen to keep walking anyway. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of the base found its way back into order. The drills, the inspections, the quiet hum of discipline that never really stopped, only changed its tune. Yet something unspoken hung in the air, a kind of reverence that lingered like salt in the wind. Harper felt it in the way conversations paused when she entered a room, in the way the younger sailors straightened unconsciously when she passed, their voices lowered, their laughter tempered. Respect was not demanded. It was learned, often the hard way. And for the first time in years, Harper felt that the uniform, though no longer on her shoulders, had never truly left her. On a gray morning, heavy with mist, she found herself summoned back to the command building. The general waited in the conference room, his coat folded neatly over the chair beside him, the faint smell of coffee and wet concrete clinging to the air. "You've been quiet," he said as she entered, his tone more observation than accusation. "That's new for someone who just saved the Pacific." Harper gave a faint smile. "Maybe the ocean taught me how to hold my breath." He leaned forward, sliding a folder across the table. "Commands reviewed the operation. They're calling it a containment success. They want you to debrief the Joint Chiefs next week." She stared at the folder, but didn't open it. "They'll want a narrative," she said slowly, her voice even but weary. "They'll want to hear about triumph and control." The general's expression softened. "And you'll give them the truth. You earned that right." Harper shook her head. The truth isn't a headline, sir. It's a grave you visit alone. Her words hung in the room like smoke, heavy and impossible to dispel. After a long pause, the general spoke again, quieter this time. The men, you've seen them. They're different now. The way they move, the way they talk about the sea. They've started volunteering for search and rescue rotations. They said if you could go back down there, they could at least face the surface. Harper's eyes flickered with something between pride and grief. Then maybe that's all this was for, she murmured. Not to prove survival, but to remind them what it costs. Outside, rain began to fall, steady and fine, tracing pale streaks down the windows. The sound filled the silence between them, soft but relentless. The general reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small metal pin, the same trident serpent insignia that had once marked her unit. They restored your record, he said, placing it gently on the table. Officially, you never left service. Harper looked at it for a long moment, the symbol gleaming faintly under the fluorescent light. Maybe it's time someone else wore it, she said at last. The ocean doesn't need me anymore. The general nodded, though the resignation in his eyes betrayed his understanding. Maybe not, he said quietly, but people still do. He stood, saluted her with quiet respect, and left the room without another word. When the door closed, Harper sat in the stillness for several minutes before reaching for the pin. It was colder than she remembered, heavier somehow, as if it carried not just her past but the weight of everyone who had vanished beneath the waves. She turned it over in her palm, the engraved motto barely legible now, through depth, honor. That night, Harper walked the perimeter of the base, her boots crunching softly over gravel slick with rain. The lights from the barracks shimmered through the fog, blurring into halos that made the world feel both near and unreachable. She stopped near the flight line where an old aircraft sat covered in canvas, long decommissioned but not forgotten. Its wings were streaked with rust, its body marked with faded lettering that once spelled freedom in metal and oil. She ran her hand along its fuselage, feeling the cold texture of the past pressing against her palm. In the distance, the sea called again, not with violence this time, but with memory. The wind carried a faint echo of voices, or maybe it was only her mind weaving ghosts into the sound of the tide. Still watching me, she whispered into the night. Still making sure I don't get comfortable? The answer came in silence, as it always did, but she felt it nonetheless, a reassurance in absence, a command without words. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the base washed clean and bright. Harper stood by the training yard, watching the recruits run drills under the sergeant's barked orders. Their movements were sharp but uncertain, every repetition a rehearsal for something none of them could yet imagine. One of them stumbled, fell hard, and looked up in frustration. Harper walked over, her steps measured, and offered him a hand. "Try again," she said simply. The recruit blinked, startled, then nodded, rising to his feet. "Yes, ma'am." He didn't notice the faint smile that touched her lips before she turned away. Later, she sat alone at the mess hall window, sipping black coffee gone lukewarm. Across the yard, the recruits continued their exercises, sweat glinting on their necks in the morning sunday. She thought about how young they were, how each of them carried the same fire she once had, the same belief that courage was a thing you earned in moments, not in years. But she knew better now. Courage wasn't born from adrenaline. It was the quiet endurance that followed, the willingness to wake up and keep serving when the war lived only in memory. As the day drew to a close, Harper made her way back to the docks one final time. The sky burned with the orange of evening, the sea calm and forgiving beneath it. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the insignia, turning it one last time between her fingers. "Through depth, honor," she whispered again, the words soft but certain. Then she threw it into the sea. The metal flashed once before, vanishing into the deep, swallowed by the same water that had once tried to claim her. The horizon glowed brighter for a moment, as if acknowledging the gesture. Harper stood there until the light faded, until the stars began to appear one by one. Behind her, the base lights flickered on, and the faint echo of boots on concrete carried across the night. She turned, squared her shoulders, and walked back toward them, her pace steady, her shadow long and unwavering. Somewhere in the dark, the waves whispered her call sign again. 28, a 4Z. Not as a code this time, but as a reminder that legends, like tides, never really disappear. They simply return in quieter forms. It was nearly a month before the request arrived, an official letter embossed with the insignia of the Department of the Navy, its seal pressed deep into the envelope as though the paper itself were holding its breath. Harper received it without ceremony, the courier offering a nervous salute before retreating as if he'd delivered something sacred. She carried it to her quarters, the hum of the bass faint outside her window, and laid it on the table beside her coffee mug. For a long while she didn't touch it. The world outside had moved on new missions, new recruits, new headlines, but for her, time still flowed differently, slower, like the tide after a storm that refuses to forget what it's carried. When she finally broke the seal, the letter unfolded with military precision. The words were clean, bureaucratic, careful. Commander Harper Reeve, effective immediately. You are invited to participate in a closed ceremony for recognition of service, conducted under the authority of the Joint Chiefs. Attendance is optional. Classification: declassified. The irony wasn't lost on her. 15 years erased by silence, now neatly packaged as optional. She set the letter down, staring at the neat lines of text until they blurred into white. Recognition had never been what she sought, but the thought of standing before the flag again, the thought of honoring those whose names still lay beneath the waves, pulled at something buried too deep to ignore. The ceremony was held in Washington, inside a hall whose marble floors gleamed like frozen water. The crowd was small uniforms, medals, polished shoes, faces that didn't know her story but wanted to stand close to it. She arrived in the simplest suit she owned, her hair tied back, her steps quiet. When the announcer called her name, a murmur rippled through the room. Cameras clicked. The general who had once saluted her stood beside the podium, his voice steady but threaded with emotion as he recounted the classified mission that had saved an entire coastline from collapse. Harper listened, her gaze steady on the folded flag resting near the front row. Every name stitched into that cloth was a pulse she still carried. When the applause came, it was polite, restrained. She accepted the medal, the weight of it cold against her palm, and for a moment she could almost feel the ocean pressing around her again, the silence, the gravity, the pull of something vast and unknowable. Then she stepped to the microphone, her voice low but unwavering. "I didn't come here for recognition," she began, her words falling slow and deliberate. "I came because the people who never made it home deserve to be remembered as more than coordinates on a map. They were the reason we surfaced at all." The room quieted. Even the cameras stopped clicking. "We live in a world that mistakes noise for courage," she continued. "But real courage is quieter than that. It's the act of returning, again and again, even when no one is watching." She left the stage to silence, the kind that didn't feel like absence but like understanding. Outside, the sun had already set behind the Capitol dome, casting long shadows across the reflecting pool. Harper walked alone along its edge, the city lights glimmering in the water like constellations scattered and rearranged. Her reflection rippled with each step, merging with the monuments and stars until it was no longer clear where she ended, and the memory of all she had carried began. The next morning she visited Arlington, a quiet request she'd made privately through the general. The cemetery was empty at that hour, mist curling over the headstones like breath. She found the section marked for classified service members, rows of identical marble slabs stretching into the fog. No names, no ranks, only numbers. She knelt before one marked 28, A4Z, the designation once branded into her skin, and rested her hand against the stone. "You're home now," she whispered, the words steady, practiced, as though she'd been rehearsing them her entire life. For a moment the air shifted, the soft sound of wind through the trees, the faint echo of waves that shouldn't have been there. She closed her eyes, letting the stillness wash through her. When she rose, she placed the medal she'd received the night before on the base of the stone. It gleamed faintly in the morning light, then dulled as dew gathered on its surface. She didn't look back as she walked away. Some goodbyes were not meant to be witnessed. Back at the base, the days folded into each other with the kind of rhythm that only discipline could provide. Harper resumed her quiet routines, training new technicians, calibrating systems, keeping the machinery of defense humming like the heartbeat of a country that would never fully know her name. She didn't need them to. The recruits followed her silently, their movements mirroring her precision, their questions replaced by a kind of instinctual respect. She had become something more than a legend. Now she was the measure of composure they aspired to, the living proof that service was not about orders, but endurance. One evening, as she walked across the tarmac, the young recruit, the same boy who had once mocked her, caught up beside her. "Ma'am," he said, voice tentative, "they're talking about naming a ship after you. The USS Reeve." Harper kept walking, her gaze on the horizon. "Names fade," she said softly. "Steel rusts. What matters is the hands that keep it afloat." The boy nodded, though she could tell he didn't quite understand. He would, in time. The following dawn, she stood by the pier once more. The ocean stretched before her, endless and silver under the rising Sunday. The waves rolled in, gentle and patient, like an old comrade waiting for her to speak. "You've taken enough," she murmured. "But you've also given me back what I lost." She closed her eyes, the wind tangling her hair, the sound of gulls above blending with the rhythmic slap of water against the hulls. When she opened her eyes, the horizon glowed a thin line of light that seemed to cut through both sea and sky. She raised a hand in a quiet salute, the gesture small but absolute. Then she turned and walked back toward the base, her steps unhurried, her shadow stretching behind her across the pier. Somewhere in the distance, a radio crackled to life, the signal faint but familiar. "Operator 28, a 4Z status confirmed, mission complete." Harper didn't look back. She just smiled a rare, tired, genuine smile and whispered to herself, "Mission complete." And as she disappeared into the morning light, the ocean shimmered once, as though returning the salute, a final acknowledgement between two veterans, bound by silence, depth, and honor. Autumn came quietly to the base, softening the air with the scent of rust and rain. The days shortened, the sea grew colder, and the wind began to carry a new kind of silence, the kind that comes after everything has been said, when the world itself seems to pause and listen. Harper moved through it all as if she belonged to a different tempo, slower and steadier than the rest. She had seen too much to rush, and too much to stop. The war was long over for her, yet every sound of a distant drill, every call of command over the loudspeakers, pulled her mind back to the rhythm of survival that no one else could hear. Each morning she still walked to the pier, a coffee cup in hand, her boots leaving faint impressions on the damp boards. The recruits had grown used to her quiet figure standing there at sunrise, watching the water with an expression that mixed memory and calm. Some of them saluted as they passed, others just nodded in reverence. Harper never acknowledged it. She didn't need to. The respect was mutual in a way words could never capture. She knew what they were becoming, and they saw in her what endurance looked like when stripped of glory. In the hangars, the air buzzed with preparations for a new round of exercises, fleet coordination, drone maintenance, live fire testing. Harper supervised the checks with her usual precision, clipboard in hand, her gaze catching every missed bolt, every untightened latch. "You don't fix machines," she reminded a young engineer who fumbled a screw. "You earn their trust." The boy blinked, unsure how to respond, but the lesson stuck. By the end of the day, his work was flawless. Harper signed the report without comment, the smallest hint of pride in her eyes. That evening, the general returned from Washington for an inspection, his hair grayer, his uniform sharper than the last time she'd seen him. He found her alone in the hangar, reviewing flight diagnostics. "You haven't changed," he said quietly, though there was warmth behind the words. Harper looked up briefly, a faint smile at the corner of her mouth. "Change isn't always improvement, sir. Sometimes it's erosion," he chuckled softly. "Then you're the most steadfast piece of granite we've got left." He handed her a sealed envelope, a different one this time, marked with a simple header, "Reassignment Recommendation." "They're forming a new unit," he explained, "focused on recovery and maritime rescue. They want you to lead it. Civilian command, minimal politics, all operational ethics." Harper turned the envelope in her hands, studying it as if it were something fragile. "You mean they want me to turn ghosts into guidelines?" she said finally. The general met her gaze, understanding the fatigue behind her words. "No," he said. "They want you to teach the living how not to become them." She didn't answer right away. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping against the hangar roof in a slow, patient rhythm. "I'll think about it," she said at last, her tone even. The general nodded. That's all I needed to hear. He turned to go, but before leaving, he added, "For what it's worth, Harper, what you did out there won't fade. Not in my lifetime, or theirs. When he was gone, she stood alone again, the envelope still in her hand. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. Some decisions are understood long before they're made. That night, the storm deepened. Harper sat in her quarters with the window cracked open, letting the wind move through the room. On her desk lay the remnants of her past old mission logs, faded photographs, a patch bearing the insignia of Phantom Blue. She ran her fingers across it, tracing the worn edges, remembering faces that existed now only in flickers of light and fragments of sound. The laughter in the mess hall, the rhythmic clatter of boots on steel floors, the low hum of engines that had once been her heartbeat. She closed her eyes and whispered the names under her breath, not in grief, but as roll call. In the early hours before dawn, unable to sleep, she walked down to the memorial again. The sea was dark and glassy, the horizon barely visible. She stood before the plaque, its surface glistening with dew, and spoke softly into the wind. "They're sending me back," she said. "Not down there, just back into the current." The words disappeared into the waves, carried off like a message meant for those who listened from below. For a long while she stood motionless, the chill seeping through her jacket, the sound of the water filling the spaces between heartbeats. When the first light broke, the horizon turned to silver, and Harper straightened, squaring her shoulders. The base was already stirring behind her, voices rising, engines starting, the familiar pulse of duty waking once again. She took one last look at the ocean and whispered, "You've kept your side of the promise. Now it's my turn." Then she walked back toward the hangars, the morning sun catching her silhouette and stretching it across the wet concrete like a shadow made of memory. Later that day, she gathered her small team, the same recruits who had once been boys, laughing at her tattoo, now standing before her in crisp uniforms, waiting for orders. "We're not here to chase glory," she told them. "We're here to make sure no one gets left behind. Not this time." The recruits nodded, their faces solemn, their pride silent but fierce. One of them, the youngest, asked, "What do we call ourselves, ma'am?" Harper paused, then smiled faintly. "Call it what you want. Just remember who you're doing it for." As the sun dipped again into the western sky, painting the base in orange and gold, Harper watched the team move through their first drills, focused, disciplined, alive. The sound of their cadence echoed across the field, crisp and unified, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm again. She stood at a distance, hands clasped behind her back, her expression calm, her eyes glinting with the same quiet fire that had once carried her into the depths. When darkness came, she returned to the pier, the lights of the base reflecting off the still water. She stood there for a long time, listening to the distant hum of ships far out at sea. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay the wreck of the Orpheus, sleeping beneath miles of silence. Harper closed her eyes, feeling the wind lift her hair, and whispered a final message into the night. "Still standing," she said, "still guarding." The sea answered in kind, not with words, but with a long, gentle swell that reached the shore and broke softly against the pier. Harper smiled, faint but true, and turned toward the waiting lights of the base. The night swallowed her silhouette, but her presence lingered like the tide itself, steady, eternal, and impossible to forget. Winter crept over the coast like a slow tide, replacing the salt, warm air with the bite of iron and frost. The mornings came dim and cold, the sea turning slate gray beneath a sky that looked carved from steel. Yet the naval base thrummed with its own quiet energy, the rhythm of discipline unbroken, its heartbeat steady beneath the wind. Harper felt that rhythm in her bones. Every dawn, before the bugle's first note, she stood at the edge of the pier, hands clasped behind her back, the cold biting through her gloves. It was the kind of silence only soldiers knew, the kind that wasn't empty but full of things unsaid. Her new team had grown sharper under her command, their once uncertain movements now fluid, their coordination precise. They learned to read one another without speaking, to trust the rhythm of instinct over the noise of fear. Harper trained them the way she had once been trained, through repetition, precision, and quiet respect. "The sea doesn't shout," she told them during a drill, her voice carrying over the sound of crashing waves. "It waits. Learn to listen before you move." The recruits nodded, breath misting in the cold, their eyes fixed on her like students before a master. By midday the sun hung pale and distant, the light struggling through the clouds. Harper watched her team run rescue simulations across the wet tarmac, their timing flawless. She didn't need to shout corrections anymore. Each motion carried the efficiency of understanding, each face a reflection of what discipline could become when forged in humility instead of pride. The general observed from a distance, hands folded behind his back, a faint smile ghosting across his weathered face. When he joined her later, his tone was easy, almost paternal. "You've done it again," he said, turned chaos into order. Harper didn't look at him, her gaze still following the recruits. "Order's just another word for trust, sir," she said. "You can't build it from fear." The general nodded, his breath fogging in the wind. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked after a moment. "You've done enough for 10 lifetimes." Harper's expression didn't change. "I've thought about it," she admitted, "but I think the sea would miss me." Her voice carried a quiet humor, the kind that softened the edges of truth. He chuckled, shaking his head. "You've earned peace, Harper. Don't be too proud to take it." She smiled faintly, eyes on the horizon. "Peace isn't something you take, sir. It's something you protect." Later that afternoon, she received word that the wreck of the Orpheus had finally been declared a memorial site. Divers had mapped the remains, sealed the reactor core, and installed a beacon that pulsed faintly through the dark, a signal to all passing ships, a heartbeat from the past saying, "We're still here." Harper read the report twice, her hands steady, her eyes dry. The world had moved on, as it always did, but now the ghosts she had carried were no longer nameless. They had a place in the light again. That evening, she gathered her team by the shoreline. The tide was low, and the air stung with cold. "Tomorrow you start running independent operations," she told them. "I'll stay behind for a while. Make sure the next group knows what you know." The recruits exchanged glances, unsure whether to celebrate or mourn. The youngest asked, "Ma'am, are you retiring?" Harper tilted her head slightly. "No," she said with a small smile. "Just standing down. There's a difference." She paused, scanning their faces still unlined by time, still unscarred by what they didn't yet know. "Remember this," she said quietly. "The sea doesn't owe us forgiveness. We earn it every day we keep each other alive." The next morning, frost glazed the ground like a thin sheet of glass. Harper walked the perimeter one last time, her boots crunching softly, the cold air turning each breath to steam. She paused by the flagpole, where the banner snapped sharply in the wind. The general approached, his gloved hand extended. "Orders came through," he said. "You're officially relieved of active command." Harper took his hand firmly. "Then I guess this is it," she said. He shook his head. "Not it, just another start." She laughed once, the sound low and genuine. "That's what they said the first time." They stood in silence for a moment, the ocean murmuring below the cliffs. Then the general stepped back, saluted, and said softly, "Welcome home, ma'am." Harper returned the salute with crisp precision, the motion clean, the gesture final. As he walked away, she turned toward the sea once more. The waves rolled in steady intervals, each one erasing the footprints she'd left in the sand. That night, Harper sat alone in her quarters, the only light coming from the small lamp on her desk. The base was quiet now, the hum of engines gone, the air filled only with the distant rhythm of the tide. On the wall hung the framed insignia of phantom blue, the trident and serpent gleaming faintly in the lamplight. Beneath it rested a single photograph. Her unit, years younger, laughing on the deck of the Orpheus, unaware of how short their time together would be. She reached out, brushed a speck of dust from the glass, and whispered, "We finished it." Outside, snow began to fall, slow, silent, unhurried. Harper opened the window, letting the cold air seep in. The sea beyond was almost invisible, blurred into the horizon. She thought about the long years that had carried her here, the battles fought, the people lost, the weight she'd carried quietly because someone had to. For the first time in a very long while, she allowed herself to feel tired, not with defeat, but completion. Before turning in, she walked once more to the pier, her coat pulled tight against the wind. The world was white and still, the stars faint behind thin clouds. She looked out at the dark water, the surface calm, the beacon from the Orpheus blinking faintly in the distance, a heartbeat she could almost believe belonged to her. "Still holding," she murmured. "Still standing, watch." Then, with the same quiet resolve that had guided every step of her life, she turned away from the sea and walked back toward the sleeping base. The snow erased her footprints behind her, but the rhythm of her stride carried forward, measured, disciplined, unbroken, the cadence of someone who had turned survival into grace. And as dawn edged the horizon, the ocean whispered her call sign once more, low and steady like the pulse of memory. 28A4Z mission complete. Guardian active. By spring, the frost had melted from the coastline, and the naval base began to breathe again, its rhythm slow and steady, like a heart remembering how to beat after a long silence. The air carried a new softness, now the kind that came when the wind shifted from survival to renewal. The sea glimmered blue again, gentle but endless, as if it too had learned to forgive. Harper felt that change beneath her skin, in the way the morning light fell through the windows of her quarters, in the faint hum of the engines that no longer sounded like ghosts but like life continuing. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to stand still long enough to notice the quiet. Her days had grown simpler since stepping down. She spent her mornings walking the perimeter, greeting sentries by name, offering advice to technicians who still looked to her as if she were carved from myth. In the afternoons, she worked in the training yard, watching her recruits run drills they had once fumbled through, now performing with the precision and calm she had tried to teach them. She no longer barked orders, no longer corrected with the cold edge of command. Instead, she stood in the shade, arms folded, the faintest smile ghosting her lips whenever one of them made a small mistake and fixed it without prompting. Discipline wasn't about perfection, it was about awareness, and they were learning that now. The general visited often, though his reasons had changed. They no longer spoke of missions or reports, only of the base and its people, the living proof that the cycle of service could still carry meaning. "You know," he said one afternoon, watching the recruits march in formation, "they're calling this place the Harper Doctrine. Quiet strength, unwavering duty. It's spreading through every division." Harper chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Doctrines fade," she said. "Habits stay. Teach them the habits." He smiled. "That's exactly what you've done." As the weeks passed, the ocean began to call again, not as a summons, but as a reminder. Harper often found herself drawn to the pier at dusk, standing where the sky met the sea, her reflection fractured by the water's movement. The beacon from the Orpheus still blinked far out in the distance, faint but faithful. It was the heartbeat of a memory that refused to vanish. She found comfort in that light, not as a wound but as proof that something she'd once loved still endured. One evening, as she watched the horizon turn gold, the young recruit who had once followed her like a shadow approached with hesitant steps. His posture was straighter now, his face older, shaped by experience and humility. "Ma'am," he said softly, "they've offered me a transfer to the Atlantic Rescue Unit. I wanted to ask, should I go?" Harper turned, studying him for a long moment. "Do you want to go?" she asked. He nodded, though his eyes flickered with uncertainty. "I think so, but I don't know if I'm ready." Harper's gaze softened, and she gestured toward the sea. "You're never ready," she said. "You just go. Readiness comes after courage." He smiled faintly, then straightened and saluted. "Thank you, ma'am, for everything." Harper returned the salute, her movements precise but gentle. "You earned this yourself," she said. "Now, make sure you teach someone else how." As he walked away, his silhouette shrinking against the fading light, Harper felt a quiet warmth settle in her chest, a kind of peace that came not from endings, but from continuation. The world was moving forward, and for once, it didn't need her to steer it. Later that night, the base gathered for a small ceremony. No cameras, no dignitaries, just her team, the general, and the sound of the sea behind them. They presented her with a plaque, "For service beyond duty, for honor beyond record, for courage beyond time." She said nothing when they handed it to her, only bowed her head slightly before setting it down beside her on the table. "I never worked alone," she said finally, her voice low and even. "Every act of bravery has a shadow behind it, someone unseen, someone who made it possible. If you remember that, you'll never lose your way." Afterward, as the others shared quiet laughter and stories, Harper stepped away to the edge of the dock. The stars stretched above her, clear and sharp, reflected in the dark water below. She breathed deeply, the night air cool against her skin, carrying with it the scent of the ocean and fuel and memory. For a moment she could almost hear their voices again, the crew of the Orpheus, laughing somewhere beyond the horizon. She smiled, small and tired, the kind of smile that came from knowing the dead were finally at rest. The general found her there a few minutes later, his hands in his coat pockets. "You know," he said, "some people are saying this base runs smoother now because of your methods." Harper glanced at him. "Methods don't fix people," she replied. "Belief does." He nodded, looking out at the water. "Then you've given them something to believe in." They stood in silence for a long while, listening to the waves lap against the pier. Finally, the general turned toward her, his voice quieter than before. "You could leave now, if you wanted. Go anywhere. No one would question it." Harper didn't answer right away. The wind caught her hair, pulling it loose from its braid. "Maybe," she said at last. "But the ocean hasn't finished talking yet." When the night deepened, she remained alone, watching the beacon in the distance blink in slow, patient rhythm. Each pulse felt like a conversation between past and present, between duty and peace. She realized then that legacy wasn't a monument or a medal. It was endurance, the willingness to keep showing up long after the noise had faded. Before heading back to her quarters, she whispered a final promise to the sea, her voice barely louder than the wind. "I'll keep listening," she said, "until someone else hears it too." Then she turned away, her steps soft and measured, the echo of her boots blending into the hush of the tide. In the stillness that followed, the ocean seemed to exhale a long, quiet breath of gratitude. And as the stars shimmered across its surface, the beacon of the Orpheus flickered once more, steady and eternal, as if saluting her one last time. Dawn rose slowly over the water, pale and deliberate, washing the naval base in a soft amber glow that blurred the lines between sea and sky. The air was still, touched by the scent of salt and the faint hum of engines warming in the distance. Harper stood alone at the edge of the pier, a thermos of coffee cooling in her hand, her reflection rippling faintly on the surface below. The base behind her was beginning to wake, boots striking concrete, voices rising in cadence, but she didn't turn. Her gaze stayed fixed on the horizon where the faint pulse of the Orpheus beacon blinked, steady and sure, the heartbeat of everything she'd ever been. She thought about the years that had carried her here, the missions, the faces, the unspoken weight of command, and how strange it felt to be standing in peace without needing to fight for it. The silence no longer pressed against her. It carried her, like the tide. Every lesson she had taught, every life she had touched, rippled outward beyond her reach now, shaping a generation that would never know her full story. That, she realized, was how legacy truly worked. It wasn't about being remembered. It was about leaving something behind strong enough to remember for you. The general approached from behind, his steps slow, the sound softened by the wind. He stopped a few feet away, saying nothing for a long moment. "They're naming the new fleet today," he said finally. "Your recruits are leading it." Harper nodded once, her eyes still on the water. "Good," she said quietly. "Then the sea will have better company this time." The general hesitated, then added, "They wanted to name one after you. I told them you'd hate it." A faint smile touched her lips. "You were right." He chuckled softly, the sound blending with the cry of gulls overhead. They stood together in companionable silence, the kind only two soldiers could share after years of service. "You'll stay?" he asked at last. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe not. Some stories aren't meant to end here. They just change scenery." He nodded, understanding more than her words revealed. Then, with a small salute, he turned and left her by the water, his silhouette fading into the growing light. Harper lingered. The waves rolled gently against the pier, the rhythm slow, eternal. She reached into her pocket and drew out a small coin-sized token, its surface worn smooth, the last remnant of phantom blue. She turned it between her fingers, feeling its weight, then let it fall into the sea. The splash was soft, barely audible, but she watched the ripples spread until they disappeared, swallowed by the morning calm. "Rest easy," she whispered. "We did our part." The sun climbed higher, the light glinting across the waves like silver thread. Behind her, the sound of the base swelled orders shouted, engines roaring to life, the pulse of a living machine that no longer needed her hand to guide it. She smiled once, a quiet, contented smile that reached her eyes, and whispered to herself, "Once a soldier, always a protector." Then she turned away from the water, her steps slow but certain, each one falling in rhythm with the waves behind her. As she reached the end of the pier, the wind lifted, carrying her voice back toward the sea, a soft echo that seemed to linger even after she was gone. The ocean answered with a single swell, its surface catching the light, reflecting it outward like a salute. The beacon of the Orpheus blinked one final time, brighter than before, then settled into its steady rhythm once more. And in that moment, as the world carried on and the tide began its endless return, it felt as if the ocean itself whispered her name, not in mourning, but in memory. 28 A4Z mission complete.